President Trump has had a confusing relationship with the media and the facts they report on. He has referred to major media outlets as the enemy of the people.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
Barred major news outlets from being part of press briefings, as well as told us that he and his administration are the only ones who can be trusted to give us the facts because the fake news distorts reality. Today we are going to explore three simple questions. What is fake news? Is it real in the way that President Trump talks about it? And to the extent that it is real, why is it a problem? Before I jump into the meat of this video, I want to give everyone watching a disclaimer that I, like everyone, have biases. I recognize that I have a large bias against President Trump. That being said, just because I hold a bias does not automatically make me wrong. Just like President Trump's biases don't automatically make him wrong, or any major media outlet's biases automatically make them wrong. What bias means is you should be extra careful when interpreting a source. So, just like I urge you to do with President Trump, fact check what I am saying against what I cite and make sure my warrants match my claims. So let's start first on the question of what fake news is. Where did fake news come from? According to this very comprehensive article from Politico, the idea of fake news has been around since news has. News stories meant to spew anti-Semitic messages have existed ever since the printing press. Even our founding fathers, such as Benjamin Franklin, used false stories of Native American scalpers to spread fear and hatred throughout the 13 colonies. Then, in the early 1900s, we got to the idea of yellow journalism. This is really nicely described in Thomas E. Patterson's book, Informing the Media, a great book which, by the way, I picked up at a recent trip to the Newseum in Washington, D.C., which is also the inspiration for this video. Anyways, Patterson describes yellow journalism as, quote, when vanity, advertisers' clout, and market competition led to what one critic called a shrieking, gaudy, sensation-loving, devil-may-care kind of journalism which lured the reader by any possible means, end quote. It was essentially evolved into the clickbait we know today. News is more about grabbing your attention than actually reporting facts. Yellow journalism is still prevalent today as fake news. So what classifies as fake news? Well, the earliest use of the term I can find is in reference to Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, a satirical news show with spin-offs such as The Colbert Report or Last Week Tonight. Jon Stewart was referred to by CNN's Crossfire as the most trusted name in fake news. So is satire fake news? Websites like The Onion and Clickhole, as well as satirical news shows, may be what fake news started as describing, but today it really isn't classified as such. This great article by The Guardian's Elle Hunt says that fake news is, quote, in its purest form, completely made up, manipulated to resemble credible journalism and attract maximum attention, and with it, advertising revenue. A great list of websites that resemble reputable news websites can be found on Wikipedia, such as abcnews.com.co, which mimics the design of ABC's website and posts unsubstantiated stories with little to no evidence. I would even go as far as to classify many extreme right-wing or left-wing sites, such as Breitbart News, as fake news. For example, this article makes extreme claims about the Obama administration's wiretapping of the Trump campaign and says that there is substantial evidence. It does not link us to any of these supposed primary sources or even tell us what they are. As far as many members of reputable news organizations and even policymakers such as Marco Rubio can tell, the claims are completely unsubstantiated. So what are the real problems with fake news? The first problem is that the kind of fake news that President Trump tells us to avoid and that is so controversial today are many reputable sources. The New York Times, which has won more Pulitzer Prizes than any other news outlet ever, was banned from White House press briefings because, in his words, they are always wrong.
Mr. Trump, sometimes, and maybe in the heat of a campaign, you say things and you have to dial them back. Last week, the New York Times editorial board quoted you as saying that you would impose up to a 45% tariff on Chinese goods.
That's wrong. They were wrong. It's the New York Times. They're always wrong.
Well,
he declared the media the enemy of the people, and to his credit, he called the fake news the enemy of the people.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people. In fact, in covering my comments, the dishonest media did not explain that I called the fake news the enemy of the people, the fake news.
Which I would 100% totally agree with. The problem is, though, that his definition of fake news is not consistent with what fake news means. He has labeled many left-leaning news organizations, and even pretty central ones, as fake news, and banned them from the White House press room, according to CNN's Elizabeth Landers. He and his administration instead routinely make claims and cite news that has no warrants attached to justify their actions. We are all most likely aware of Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts gap on Meet the Press. This obviously plays into the narrative about unsubstantiated claims, but I think the more telling thing is how she justifies them beforehand.
Why put him out there for the very first time in front of that podium to utter a provable falsehood? It's a small thing, but the first time he confronts the public, it's a falsehood?
Chuck, I mean, if we're going to keep referring to our press secretary in those types of terms, I think that we're going to have to rethink our relationship here. I want to have a great open relationship with our press, but look what happened the day before, talking about falsehoods. We allowed the press to come into the Oval Office and witness President Trump signing executive orders. And of course, the Senate had just confirmed General Mattis and General Kelly to their 2 posts, and we allow the press in, and what happens almost immediately? A falsehood is told about removing the bust of Martin Luther King Jr. from the Oval Office. That's just flat out false. And it was
corrected immediately.
Why was it said?
She tries to make it seem as if because CNN made one reporting error, she should be allowed to lie. Now this is important for 2 reasons. Firstly, because 2 wrongs definitely do not make a right. But secondly, because she assumes that one small mistake means that these outlets are fake news. I cannot stress the idea enough that even legitimate news sources make mistakes all the time, and that one source being wrong does not completely nullify everything they have to say. The second problem with fake news is that it will inherently be spread around more than regular, reputable news. As Thomas Patterson points out, yellow journalism is more eye-catching, more provocative than anything else. If you have seen the movies Anchorman with Will Ferrell or Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal, this is definitely a major theme. Especially in the world of cable news, journalists will often chase headlines that are the most eye-catching. This exchange in Nightcrawler is especially telling. That's only part of it. We like crime. Not all crime. A carjacking in Compton, for example, that isn't news, now is it? We find our viewers are more interested in urban crime creeping into the suburbs. That means as a victim, or victims, preferably well-off and or white, injured at the hands of the poor or a minority. Just crime? No. Accidents play. Cars, buses, trains, planes, fires, suicides. But bloody? Graphic. The best and clearest way that I can phrase it to you, Lou, to capture the spirit of what we air, is to think of our newscast as a screaming woman running down the street with her throat cut. This type of gotcha journalism is always going to be incentivized because it works. It makes money. The Guardian article from before says that, quote, a man running a string of fake news sites from Los Angeles told National Public Radio that he made as much as $30,000 a month from advertising that rewards high traffic. What this caused the Politico article to conclude about traditional news is that, quote, advertising revenue is down, staffs continue to get cut, the number of newspapers has declined by 100 since 2004. Now I want to talk about fighting back against fake news. To help you differentiate between news outlets, you may have seen some of these charts online depicting where news organizations fall on a variety of different factors. I'm going to go through each of them and tell you what I agree with and disagree with. It is important to note that no chart like this can be completely correct because everyone has different viewpoints from which they interpret different news sources. That being said, these are a good starting point for you to identify whether or not these news outlets should be questioned. I'll start with this chart. I think this chart is pretty generous to some outlets that should probably be in poor quality. For me, those are BuzzFeed, Breitbart, New York Post, The Blaze, and TPM. I think that USA Today and Black Lives Matter should probably be further left. This chart is pretty good overall with identifying positioning, but I don't like how relative the different positions are to one another. They don't really mean all that much. Next, let's look at this chart. Keep in mind this chart doesn't really show credibility, but it definitely implies that those outlets controlled by corporations are less credible. I think there's some truth to the vertical axis on this chart, but I don't really think the horizontal axis means that much. None of these are really controlled by the state at all, but the vertical axis does do a good job of telling you the size of the news outlet. Lastly, we'll look at my favorite and the most controversial among hyper-conservative news outlets, this one. I think this one is the best because it tells you how to interpret sources that fall into each sphere. My only suggestion would be to move the New York Times to the left, but staying inside the center bubble. This one does a nice job of highlighting the importance of a balance between information and partisanship. A news outlet that gives bad information is just as bad as a biased one. The reason this gets a lot of hate among conservative sites is they feel this chart is too harsh on sites like Breitbart and thus gives preference to liberal media. A quick look at the chart clearly reveals that commonly conservative outlets such as the Washington Post, The Economist, and even Fox News are given good reputations here, so I don't really think that that's a fair conclusion. Once again, I just want to point out that just because something comes from one of these bottom right or left bubbles does not automatically make it wrong. What it means is that you need to be very or extremely careful when reading these sources and fact check them extensively because they have a history of misinterpreting information or just plainly getting it wrong. Even though fake news is definitely a huge problem that isn't going away anytime soon, we aren't doomed. The history of fake news is reassuring. Even with falsely anti-Semitic messages coming off a newly invented printing press, there were always reputable sources giving us the real facts. The other side of that story is that Johannes Gutenberg thought his machine would strengthen the Catholic Church and their program of selling out forgiveness to sins. But what happened instead? A man named Martin Luther was able to produce his work, the 95 Theses, and give everyone the true Word of God and expose the corruption in the Catholic Church. The secret to defeating the fake news isn't censorship. It's a free exchange of ideas where reputable outlets can get their message to the people. And this has been a very heated topic.